Imagine logging into Marvel Rivals. You got your chippies, you got your cola, you got everything going. And you know what? You're crushing match after match, victory after victory. The streak is real. But just when you're riding high, the tide turns. Suddenly, you find yourself teamed with a bunch of noobs. And your opponents, they seem like freaking experts. Was it bad luck? Or was it something planned? This roller coaster of emotions is not organic. Some players insist it's engineered. In this investigative deep dive that I have created, this monstrosity of research, we're gonna unravel the mystery. I'm gonna take you on a journey, buddy. We're first gonna journey through the history of online game matchmaking, and then we're gonna discover how modern algorithms like EOMM and OptMatch, don't worry, those things are gonna make sense, work behind the scenes, and why many players feel the system is stacking the deck. And hey, for the last 2 weeks, I've been going blind on research papers and technical things and some bits of code at some point. And I've really intended to make a very complete, well-researched, well-thought-out video here. So your likes and comments and subscriptions are deeply appreciated. As you can see, I have less than 1,000 subscribers, and yet I'm putting in all this effort, and it makes me feel like an idiot a little bit. But at the same time, couldn't catch me dead just putting on gameplay for 40 minutes and talking like an idiot. So if you want to reward me for my effort here, you know how to do it. All right, let's jump into the video. History time. See, I thought that to understand Marvel Rivals as matchmaking, I really needed to first see how matchmaking in online gaming evolved and how it all started. And you know what? It wasn't always guided by these complex, crazy algorithms. And that sounds right. When I was playing Counter-Strike as a kid, I don't think there was much behind the scenes. So in the early days of online gaming, matchmaking really just meant just a simple lobby or a server where anybody could join. And that's how I remember it. That's what I grew up on. That's probably what you grew up on. We're both old, so you remember. It was the Wild West, man. Sometimes you're going to be facing pros way above your level and just accept the loss. And other times you're going to be running people over because it's just a noob that joined. There was a push for fair matches, right? So this push led to skill rating systems. A really good example that I found is the ELO rating system from chess, of all things, which inspired early game rankings. I thought that was pretty cool. So by 2004, the developers of Halo 2 were messing around with a new Bayesian rating called TrueSkill to improve upon ELO. And I think that's where it all starts. See, TrueSkill aimed to quickly estimate a player's skill and then match them up with others of similar ability, making the matches a bit more balanced. Throughout 2000s and 2010s, a lot of competitive games like League of Legends, Dota 2 adopted such skill-based matchmaking systems. By the way, this skill-based matchmaking thing is just, we're going to call it SBMM because that abbreviation is going to show up a lot later in the video, so just remember it. Skill-based matchmaking, say it with me. And now this SBMM, it led to this matchmaking rating, or it was often tied to it, which is MMR, which is probably something you're familiar with. And that rises with your wins and losses, your MMR, right? Got me? Skill-based matchmaking, it takes MMR, they do this, or maybe this, and then you got TrueSkill. That's basically what it was. Story time! Picture a 2007 Halo 3 lobby back in the peak of delicious racism. The game's SBMM quietly crunches numbers like a coach figuring out which players to let play. So, if you're a sharpshooter in the last games and you had perfect aim and you just killed everybody, the system is then going to bump up your invisible skill number a bit, and then next match, it's going to try to seat you at the table with players of comparable aim. And the goal of all of that was really simple, just fair fights. So, at its core, SBMM treated matchmaking like a chess tournament. So you're going to match grandmasters with grandmasters, and you're going to match novices with novices. Pretty simple. But as online gaming grew and expanded, a new question came up. What if fair fights are not the only goal? So naturally, game companies started to notice something. Player retention, how long you keep playing, is a fragile thing. And it kind of makes sense. A perfectly fair system might inadvertently cause some players to quit. So then, of course, developers started to wonder, could matchmaking be tuned not just for fairness, but to keep players engaged? See, this led to the rise of engagement optimized matchmaking, which was the natural evolution from SBMM to this, or EOMM, engagement optimized matchmaking. See, in 2017, a team at Electronic Arts published a paper titled EOMM, Engagement Optimized Matchmaking Framework. It was really a watershed moment. The paper suggested that perfectly fair matches are not always the best for keeping players hooked. Instead of only using skill, the EOMM framework added new ingredients to the matchmaking recipe. The first one was churn probability. This is an estimate of how likely you are to quit playing if you have a bad or good experience. The second one were dynamic adjustments. So the system could even change its objective, which is nuts. The researchers then noted that they could retune the matchmaking goal to maximize other things like playtime, retention, or even spending, which is when it gets real creepy. To dumb this down a little bit so it's a little bit easier to digest, EOMM was basically matchmaking meeting data science for the first time ever. So here's how I like thinking about it. I imagine the matchmaking system as a casino dealer who doesn't just deal cards randomly, but also keeps an eye on every player's mood. So if, for example, you're getting upset and might leave the table, the dealer then might just tweak the next round in your favor a little bit. Not enough to be obvious, but enough to keep you in the game. Or if you're winning too much and you're starting to get bored, maybe the next round he gives you a bit more challenge. So I don't think it's outright cheating. The cards are still, dealt from the same deck, but the order of the cards might be influenced by another motive, keep the game going. That's kind of what's going on here. So around the same time, other gaming giants are starting to wake up and are starting to explore very similar ideas. In fact, Activision, they made Call of Duty, filed a patent for a matchmaking system that could encourage microtransactions by pairing players strategically. Wow. It sounds like Activision, to be honest. So here's how it worked. For example, they'll be matching a newbie with a veteran who has a bunch of premium cool gear and then hope that the newbie is going to be enticed to buy that gear. What the fuck? The industry clearly was interested in matchmaking as more than just fair competition. It was becoming a tool to drive player behavior. Enter Marvel Rivals. See, the game is still very, very young. As of the making of this video, we're in Season 1, so it's still a baby. And the game came onto the scene a few months ago with really fun hero battles, a great IP, fantastic animations and sound design, and this promise of a really fun competitive team play. But behind the Marvel heroes is a developer with a very research-oriented approach to matchmaking, and that's NetEase. Their involvement is really crucial because they have been at the forefront of implementing engagement-based matchmaking systems in their games, guided by research like OptMatch and EnMatch, which we're going to talk about in a second. Now, let's break down what I already know and suspect about Marvel Rivals' matchmaking. The very first thing is that Marvel Rivals does not appear to have a traditional, pure SBMM where only skill matters. Instead, a lot of evidence suggests that it uses a system influenced by EOMM principles. Potentially, it's an in-house variant that they call OptMatch. Then the goal of such a system is just to balance matches in a way that optimizes and maximizes player satisfaction and engagement, not just skill parity, which is very different. Next, we're about to get nerdy, and I really like learning about these things, but we're going to talk about kind of the science behind the scenes. EOMM, OptMatch, and things like EnMatch. They'll become clear as I talk. So to roll the tape back a bit, in August 2020, NetEase researchers published OptMatch, optimizing matchmaking via modeling the high-order interactions on the arena. What this was essentially an engagement-oriented matchmaking system, but with a really interesting twist. It still valued fair, close games as a route to happy players, but OptMatch also introduced a two-phase approach. Number one was offline learning. So what it does is that it analyzes a ton of game data to understand things like composition and player performance, things like that. The paper then describes features like Hero 2 Vec and Player 2 Vec, basically learning the characteristics of heroes and players. So things like who works well with whom, which heroes synergize, so Iron Man amplifying Hulk, or one character covering another one's weakness, Also, it thinks about how does this player usually perform and what heroes are they best with. So that's the first one. The second one is online matchmaking planning. So with all of this knowledge, when you hit find match, the system isn't just, randomly throwing 6 players into 2 teams and calling it a day. No, it's thinking. It's evaluating like thousands of possible team combinations among players of pretty much the same rank. So it's as if the matchmaking is playing like a giant game of Tetris, fitting different pieces together, which are actually the players, into 2 balanced teams. Yeah, it uses a utility function, which is essentially a score for how satisfying a matchup is predicted to be for each player, and then tries to maximize that. If putting you and player B on the same team, let's say because your favorite heroes complement each other or something, leads to a higher satisfaction score, the system leans that way. However, if grouping, I'll just give you a bad example, but grouping too many tanks or too many supports of the same role makes the team worse, then it's going to avoid that. So OptMatch's philosophy in 2020 was still fair matches equals happy players. At this stage, it wasn't, rigging outcomes. It was trying to make matches as fair and as fun as possible by really smartly considering hero dynamics and player playstyles, which I think is pretty cool. I'll give you a metaphor here to help you digest this a bit more. It's like a sports coach who not only matches teams by skill, but also thinks, okay, this team has all strikers and no goalkeepers, so that's going to be pointless and not fun, so let's swap it around a bit to balance roles. However, later developments show that NetEase didn't just stop there. By December 2020, the same researchers put out a GitHub simulation testing different matchmaking algorithms, including EOMM. It's way too nerdy, it didn't make any sense, but it was pretty cool to see. So at a Game Developers Conference in 2021, or GDC, NetEase detailed how they started integrating this churn prediction and player streaks into the equation. And this is where things get intriguing and kind of controversial, I think. So they introduced this concept of player utility that included not just fairness, but also match duration, queue time, and recent win-loss streaks. For example, if you've been on a losing streak, the system is going to take that into account. Your utility, for example, how happy you'll be in the next match, might be lower because you're frustrated. So it's just going to compute all of that. Then the matchmaking might respond by trying to give you a better experience the next round to keep your spirits up. More specifically, that could mean aiming for a match that's predicted to be close and exciting, or ensuring to get you into the game quicker, or maybe balancing the teams in such a way that you have a fair shot despite recent losses. In that GDC talk, one slide specifically contained a really interesting line: give tiny advantages to the desperate or fatigued players during matchmaking if possible. For example, choose the win rate of 51% instead of 49% matchmaking proposals for those players. This basically implies that if the system has a choice between 2 possible matchups, one where it predicts you have a 49% chance to win, and one where predicts you have a 51% chance to win, and you've been on a rough losing streak, so by their definition, you're maybe desperate or fatigued, it will gently nudge you towards the 51% scenario. In other words, it's becoming a slight kind of hidden handicap in your favor just to help you out. On the flip side, it also made me think, what about winning streaks? So the research doesn't really explicitly say give disadvantages to players on winning streaks. However, if the system is always nudging losing streak players upward a bit, then, the logical consequence is that if you are on a winning streak, you might lose that gentle nudge. Makes sense, right? So you're essentially left to face the full force of competition, or maybe even given a slightly tougher matchup if others are being boosted. And this could naturally result in your streak coming to an end sooner or later, not because the game hates you, but because it just stops giving you training wheels. So NetEase continued to refine this approach time and time again. In a 2024 paper, they very frankly state that the traditional fair matchmaking The SBMM thing, dividing players strictly by skill tiers, is not always good for player engagement. They cite a couple of prior works like the 2017 EOMM paper that we talked about earlier, which showed that just focusing on fair matches isn't sufficient for keeping players hooked. This new approach doubled down on engagement. Mix it up to maximize fun and retention is the general strategy. One analogy that was given by a NetEase researcher was, even if you have 12 players of similar skill, you don't always make two teams of equal skill. Maybe, you mix high skill and low skill players on each side in some scenarios, if that pattern leads to better overall engagement. But they found that a bit of variety, occasionally playing with or against someone notably better or notably worse than you, could keep things interesting. So maybe perhaps that underdog upset, or, you face someone really good and you're learning from a really skilled teammate or opponent. Maybe those things make the sessions a bit more memorable and enjoyable. So Rivals' matchmaking is born from this lineage of research, which I thought is kind of cool. First of all, it likely groups players by their general skill brackets. So a beginner is not going to get matched directly against some top-tier veteran in a normal scenario. That just would be unfair. The second thing is, within that broad skill group, it's going to consider a variety of factors. So things like team composition, predicted fairness, and probably your recent performances and engagement metrics too. Also, it might occasionally, and this happened to me, create matches where one team has a carry player, like a star player, and the other team doesn't. And then it balances that by giving the star player weaker teammates and the other team solid mid-level players. And it tries to keep your win rate around a pretty moderate level. And it's not doing that by forcing outcomes. I don't think it can, but by dynamically adjusting the challenges that you face. A consistently winning player will be moved up against stronger opposition, or maybe even given less backup, while a struggling player might catch a break with easier opposition or maybe some more support. So over many games, this feels like some invisible hand that is ensuring that most players hover roughly around 50% wins. So in the Marvel Rivals community, a common refrain that you hear is, the matchmaking's rigged. But what do players really mean by that, and why do they feel it, is what I was wondering constantly. So I went out and I went to forums, typically from Steam and Reddit and other places, and just read through threads, and here's what people say. The first one is that 50-50 win rate feeling. Players like you and me often notice that just no matter how well you play, your win rate just tends to gravitate around 50%. So for every hot streak where they just won a bunch of games, a cold streak follows. And it's this feeling that it's almost looming, right? You're playing, you're killing it, it's going great, and you're like, crap, something's coming. The players have voiced that the system seems to kind of give you wins and then suddenly throw you into guaranteed losses, creating a really strong oscillating pattern. And in different forums, some of the players claim that the game tries to satisfy everyone with a 48 to 52% win-loss ratio, regardless of whether you're a noob or a pro. It can certainly feel that way, and I know we've all been there. You dominate a few rounds and a few matches, and then the next matches, your team is just mysteriously uncoordinated, or the other guys are just murderers. So it's as if the game is just a rubber band. You stretch too far ahead in wins, and then it just snaps you back with defeats. From a player's perspective, this can be really infuriating. Like, why is the game punishing me for winning? So in a traditional SBMM system, consistent wins would simply mean that you climb to a higher skill bracket. So you'd be facing tougher opponents. Also, ideally, your teammates would also be of higher skill too. However, if Marvel Rivals is indeed using engagement-optimized matchmaking, it's not just sliding you up and down a skill ladder. It might be actively orchestrating the challenge level to keep you in that sweet spot of engagement that it's looking for. To a competitor, this feels like just some arbitrary ceiling on their success. Hence, the feeling of a rigged system ensuring you don't win too much. The second one is, being the team MVP on a losing match. This gripe is interesting. Why do I always get the bad teammates? Is a question a lot of people answer. Well, players who consistently perform well, say, somebody in the top 500 or someone that's just good, but still lose matches, really are starting to suspect that the matchmaking is giving them weaker teammates on purpose. You might have a game where you go 15-2, with Cap, which is hard to do with Cap. But two of your teammates just barely contribute and are basically throwing. It's completely natural to wonder, was I just placed with weaker players intentionally? Some Rivals fans believe exactly that the game, knowing that you're strong, is going to pair you with a couple of weaker folks just to balance the team's overall power, and maybe even, perhaps give those weaker players a chance to be carried to a close match. All of this ties back to the research idea of mixing skill levels on a team for engagement. While I do agree that this can create some pretty exciting comeback stories, and it certainly has for me, it does also mean that as a skilled player, you're sometimes essentially handicapped by your team because of how matchmaking works. And that can definitely feel like the system is rigged against you. One Reddit user wryly noted that the matchmaking creates a full profile of your account and attempts to match you with teammates that synergize or don't based on how it wants to push your games. So that Instalock 215 Spider-Man on your team isn't just random chance. In other words, players suspect that the algorithm might sometimes deliberately give you a teammate who picks a hero they're terrible at, so that's the Spider-Man who gets 2 kills and dies 15 times, in order to create a particular match outcome or experience. I know it sounds a little bit conspiratorial, but given the complexity of the system, players are just connecting the dots in ways that seem plausible to them. Next is one of my favorite terminologies, the loser's queue and forced losses. Beyond just statistical balancing, some players go further and suggest that there's a loser's queue. And that's basically a hidden state where you enter after a certain number of wins where the game ensures you lose the next one or few. So they'll recount anecdotes like, I won 5 games in a row, and then suddenly I got 3 matches in a row with AFK teammates or complete beginners on my team. I could practically predict I was due for a loss. That's literally what he said. So it's really hard to prove such patterns as anything more than anecdotal, but the perception is very powerful, and I see that. The community's trust is eroding here and there, and every tough loss becomes, well, not a learning moment. It should be a learning moment, but it starts to become this evidence for rigging. Rivals' EOMM system is very often accused of manipulating streaks on purpose. One specific player described it as a psychological tug of war, which I thought was nicely dramatic, where the game just gives you the high of a winning streak and then yanks it away. This claim unfortunately does align with what we discussed earlier. To keep players hooked, the system might orchestrate some ups and downs, right? That's what we talked about. However, players understandably feel that a loss isn't fair if it was engineered in any way. If you believe that you're losing a match and that was predestined by the algorithm's unseen hand, that's essentially the definition of rigging in a competitive context, and that's what people think. Another one that I was glad to see, which is the first thing that came to mind with all this stuff, was the lack of transparency or basically the black box effect. So part of what fuels the rigged narrative here is that the matchmaking system is a black box. The game in no way tells you how it decides teams. There's no official readout of your MMR or how it pairs you, nothing. So when humans don't have an explanation, we tend to fill in the blanks. If you lose a match that felt unfair, it's way easier to blame the unseen algorithm than to chalk it up to just random chance, personal mistakes, or just a skill issue. Especially when you see patterns over dozens of matches, your brain looks for a reason. Players also talk to each other, and I see it even in chat. We're sharing stories of bizarre matches, suspicious patterns, and, kind of half-remembered quotes from dev interviews or leaked code. So in Rivals' case, the existence of these actual research papers by the developers is like pouring gasoline on the fire. It's pretty rare, to be honest, that players have such direct hints at what might be going on behind the scenes. I know for me, I've never really had access to research papers that explain something about an online competitive game I'm playing, and that's the product of this video as well. So when they read things or a line in the paper like, fair games are not sufficient to ensure player engagement from NetEase's own paper? Yeah, it's super easy to jump to conclusions. Aha! They don't care about fair matches at all. They only care about engagement. They'll do whatever it takes to make us play more, even if it means rigging games, you bastards. The emotional toll is notable. I mean, it feels personal sometimes. Games are emotional experiences. I would even argue that Rivals is even more of an emotional experience because there's a team involved. And there's this accountability or lack thereof. There's this thing where people are delusional and you don't want to accept your own mistakes, so you look to others. It's like a tiny little society. It's very interesting. But when you lose because you got outplayed, it stings. It sucks. But you can accept it and try to improve. But when you lose and feel helpless, like nothing you could have done would change the outcome, then it breeds frustration and conspiracy. So Rivals players have expressed that EOMM undermines the core satisfaction of improving as a player. And that's a quote, by the way. Undermines the core satisfaction of improving as a player, making success or failure feel disconnected from your skill. That's a pretty strong psychological blow, you know? If practice and skill building don't guarantee better results, you know, because the matchmaking will just throw a wrench in it, then why try at all? I'm spending time in aim trainers and in the practice mode. What's that practice mode for if I'm just going to lose because the game makes it? You know, this perceived lack of player agency drives people to conclude that the system is fundamentally unfair. It's not just that one match was off. It's the idea that the entire ladder is a lie. You're not truly in control of your rank because the game is just pulling strings in the background. And that's even a more sensitive issue when people try to rank. You know, when you're trying to actually get better at the game and earn certain rewards, then it starts to get a little controversial. So all these perceptions start to create a really powerful narrative that Marvel Rivals' matchmaking is rigged, which I'm not sure if I would use that word, but that's what people feel. It's important to note here that, you know, not every player feels this way. Some climb the ranks and feel the only thing stopping them is the next skill hurdle. And that's a fantastic mindset to have. And if you have that, congratulations. But the fact that enough players share the rigged perception means that it's a real community issue that I thought was worth investigating, which is why I'm making this video. Now let's peek behind the accusations. You know, how does Marvel Rivals' matchmaking actually work? Let's pose the big question. Are these rigging claims true? What does the evidence say about Marvel Rivals' matchmaking mechanics and their effects? Let's analyze this point by point, comparing player claims with what we know from research and data. The first claim, as you remember, was that the system forces a 50% win rate for everyone. So it's not literally forcing a precise 50% on everyone. Some players do maintain higher win rates, especially in team games where you can party up with your friends and communicate directly and practice together, or some players are just amazing at their characters, right? And they're just very talented. However, this engagement optimized design does tend to nudge everyone towards the middle. So the EOMM logic from the EA paper, and some other ones as well, explicitly tries to avoid long losing or winning streaks because those can reduce engagement. If Marvel Rivals indeed uses that logic, then over time, most players will experience roughly equal wins and losses by design. Not because the game predetermines each match outcome, but because if you start deviating too high or too low, the matchmaking adapts. It's just going to snap you back to the middle. Win a lot, and as a result, you're going to be facing tougher matchups. You're going to have, stronger opponents, maybe even less favorable team comps until you lose. Or lose a lot, and you're going to get easier matchups, so weaker opponents, strong ally, or even bots inserted to help until you win. So it's basically a rubber band effect. And I talked about it earlier, but racing games like Mario Kart famously give the leading racer weaker power-ups and the trailing racer powerful boosts, like the fucking blue shells, just to keep the races close and unpredictable. So Marvel Rivals' matchmaking appears to be doing a kind of a similar thing, but with how it forms its matches. This doesn't mean that every player is exactly at 50%. Of course, we know that. Highly skilled players can still maintain a very positive win rate over hundreds of games, and very new players might be below the 50% as they learn, but the system's intent is to keep you around an equilibrium where you win about as much as you lose, therefore preserving that kind of tension and the drive to play just one more match, which Marvel Rivals has that in spades. So there is some truth to this claim, but calling it forced might be too strong. It's just probabilistic adjustment, not a guarantee, you know? One community analysis even pointed out that nowhere in the available research was there a statement that one team will always get an advantage over the other, or that the outcomes are pre-decided. So the matches themselves aren't fixed. You always have a chance to win. It's just that the conditions are tuned to make those chances hover over the 50-50 for most players. The second claim was that matchmaking gives me bad teammates on purpose to make me lose. So this one's really tricky. If we interpret bad as in lower skilled teammates, if we agree on that, the research does suggest that this does happen occasionally by design. EnMatch findings show that a team composition of mixed skill, so what that means is 1 high skill and 2 low skill in a 3v3 team, for example, can improve overall engagement versus all players being of equal skill. Yeah, the algorithm might sometimes pair a strong player with weaker ones. That can happen. However, it's not as simple as to make you lose. In theory, those matches are still intended to be winnable. The other team might also have a mix. Maybe one medium-sized anchor instead of a high-skilled star, but all pretty decent. The purpose here, the aim, is that the match is close. That's it. The danger is that if you, as a high-skilled player, don't perform exceptionally well or to the standard that the game expects you to, and you might indeed lose and then just feel held back by your allies. And what about the extreme case, like deliberately griefing you with team members who are far below your skill? Well, regular ranked play probably won't put a top tier and bottom tier player together often because of the initial grouping by skill. So probably not going to happen. But in edge case scenarios, or if the population is low at your skill level, and that leads to kind of wider searches, you might see it. So also, if the system thinks that you're likely to carry and still have a fair match, it might gamble on a wider skill gap team. So then it can happen as well. But most importantly, there's no evidence whatsoever that the system identifies a specific player to punish and then assigns bad teammates out of spite. It's not like that. It's more systemic. It just treats everyone as part of the big engagement equation. So you might get bad teammates one match and then be the bad teammate in another match, and then it all kind of balances out. So one thing that I thought really debunks the more paranoid version of this claim is that like the truly horrible mismatches would ruin engagement, not improve it. If Marvel Rivals put a newbie on your high-ranked team, that newbie would be miserable. They're going to crush him. They're going to go after him. He'll be angry, might throw, you'll be angry at them. That's a lose-lose scenario for the purpose of boosting engagement and enjoyment of the game. In other words, it would create churn, which is something that these algorithms do take into account and try to avoid at any cost. So the more likely scenario here, I think, is that you just get teammates slightly below your level paired against opponents slightly above your team's average. And then if that's done right, the match could still be balanced. So from your POV, you notice that your allies are making more mistakes than you, and it just feels unfair. I think that's what's going on. The third claim is that the game secretly adjusts gameplay, so damage, hitboxes, etc., or uses bots to influence outcomes. Okay, this one is a bit wacky, but this is a deeper conspiracy floating around that I've seen. So some players speculated some crazy things like the game might dynamically nerf your damage output if you're on a winning streak, or expand an enemy's hitbox to ensure you miss. Essentially, kind of invisible handicaps beyond just team composition. And one person said that that's why they don't have the damage numbers, so we can't tell. So as of now, there's zero concrete evidence for such kind of real-time in-match rigging. that would be far more akin to actual match fixing and probably detectable if somebody records and analyzes gameplay data. I've just never bothered to do that. All indications from the research papers that I read are that the rigging, if any, happens is kind of at the matchmaking stage, not within the match. And I'm even careful to call it rigging, but you know what I mean. So the game isn't altering your bullets or your hero's health on the fly under the guise of matchmaking. It would be a technical and I also think ethical can of worms for the developers to do that. As for bots, Marvel Rivals, like many games, does use bots in some modes or just a backfill if a human player isn't available. So that makes sense. Like the allegation is that after a string of losses, you might be placed into a match where one or two of your teammates are actually AI bots disguised as, player-like names who are tuned to play well with you or let you shine, thereby, boosting your morale or something. So in community discussions, some claim to have noticed patterns like teammates that behave oddly or too predictably and suspect that they're bots put there to help them out. The developers have not confirmed this. If true, it would be an extreme form of engagement optimization, like literally rigging a win for you by using dummy players, right? So it's plausible in theory. Single player games tend to adjust difficulty all the time. But here it would be like adding an NPC on your team to just tilt the odds. Whatever, but without official word or data, we should just take this claim with a grain of salt. It's a little crazy. The next claim was engagement optimized means that the game cares more about profit than players. This is more of a sentiment and a feeling rather than a factual claim, but it does underpin the rigged narrative. So players feel that if the goal isn't pure competition, then the developers must be manipulating matches to make money. For example, by keeping you to play longer, so maybe you spend on a cool skin, or just frustrating you enough to just, hey, maybe if I buy a new skin, I'll play better. I don't know. There's some truth to, that engagement often correlates with revenue in free-to-play games. If you play longer, there are more chances and opportunities for you to just buy something. And, we saw that in the EA paper, they outright mentioned possibly tuning matchmaking for spending metrics. Who knows? Maybe they're doing it here. I don't know. But let's be objective. Engagement doesn't only benefit the company. It can also benefit the player too, in terms of having more people to play with. A game that retains players well is alive and fun. The community is great. A game that is brutally fair but hemorrhages newbies might end up in a graveyard where only the hardcore remain. And I can tell you for sure, other games I play are games like Tekken, where it came off and started off with a lot of players, and now whoever's left are just the sweat lords. And it's a murder scene in there. So this is definitely true. The developers likely do want you to have fun, just enough fun and some ups and downs, so that you can just keep coming back and having different emotional experiences. And I know it's a delicate balance. If they push too hard for profit and then make the experience unenjoyable, then it backfires and players leave. And we've seen that many times before. So while, yes, the system is there in part to increase metrics that tie to profit, I don't think it's just a simple evil versus good scenario. They're trying to align what keeps you playing with what you enjoy, just with maybe a heavier hand than some would like. That's it. And they have to make money, right? Somehow. And the game is free, so I'd be okay with a little push towards profit. Another claim was that if I am stuck in rank, it's the matchmaking's fault. All right, so this is the classic ELO hell argument heard in other games from, Overwatch all the way to League of Legends, now echoed in Marvel Rivals. So the idea is that you might belong in a higher rank. Say you believe that you have the skill of a diamond player. But the matchmaking system's tricks keep you stuck in gold by throwing unwinnable games at you. Is it true? For a consistently excellent player, probably not in the long run. There's a YouTuber whose name is Awkward, and I think he's a former Overwatch guy, and he took Mantis on a 100% winning streak. I think he went all the way from bronze to GM over a 6-hour period. So obviously there's outliers for these things, but while engagement matchmaking can, really slow down how quickly you climb, because it will feed you some losses even if you're good, as Awkward showed, if you genuinely outperform your peers significantly, you're going to rise. So we see top players, they're able to reach the highest ranks in Marvel Rivals. We see it happen, not constantly, but pretty frequently. And they also deal with the same system, right? But their skill carries them through the artificial hurdles that the game throws at them. On the other side, there's one high-level player that pointed out that they've seen top-tier players smurf, basically play on new accounts, and even they lose games in bronze on occasion. So that's normal variance. I think over a large sample, they will still climb, right? They're great players. The engagement system doesn't really lock doors. It perhaps adds some extra zigzags to the path upward, but it doesn't lock doors. So if someone is truly hard stuck in a rank over hundreds of games, it's likely that their current skill level, as harsh as that may sound, and you may disagree, that's what's holding them back. The system might have given them a few more bad dice rolls than a purely random system would, but not an impenetrable wall. In fact, one commenter encouraged that you're not in bronze, silver, or gold because EnMatch is rigging your games. You're in those ranks because you belong there. It's a tough love statement, I know, but statistically it's probable. The engagement-focused matchmaking can impact your experience of climbing, so making it, streakier or perhaps slower, but there's no evidence that it stops you from climbing entirely. And why would it? So stepping back from the specific claims, let's weigh in what the matchmaking approach does well and where it falters. First, let's talk about the pros. The first one that I can identify is more exciting matches in theory. So by avoiding just complete stomps and long, monotonic streaks, the system strives to give you a mix of wins and losses that just keep the outcome of each session uncertain. Close matches, come from behind victories, and the occasional kind of nail biters are really fun. I feel that system on me. I remember my matches. I remember the close calls, and I remember the stomps occasionally, and I remember the feeling of coming back or the feeling of having it and losing it. That's still an experience. So a purely fair system can sometimes produce pretty boring, kind of predictable matches. Imagine always knowing you'll crush or be crushed with no in between. The engagement approach kind of injects a bit of the unexpected in there. So as one NetEase summary put it, it aims for patterns that improve player retention by keeping things diverse. Another really big pro for me is retention of new or casual players. So new or less skilled players are much less likely to be thrown into just a meat grinder of constant losses. I talked about Tekken 8 before. That's what it is. You cannot rank up. These motherfuckers have been playing that game for 30 years. You cannot. It's just impossible. So unless you're willing to put in that work or be super talented, you're screwed. You can't. If the system detects that they're at risk of quitting, so basically their churn probability is high, then it will try to give them a better experience. Maybe that one match where they get to be the hero or be really impactful, So that compassion towards the lower end of the skill curve typically means that more players stick around, which is healthy for the game population and it's healthy for the game. And it's just no fun for anyone if only the hardcore players remain and the queue times skyrocket. And I guess this is also why Marvel's has been able to maintain the player count it has pretty much since launch. So I see this as a really big thing, and I hope this never changes. I sort of talked about it already, but faster queue times is a big deal, man. With a really flexible system like that, then the matchmaking can sometimes relax some strict skill matching to get players into games faster. If the top priority was perfectly even skill, then higher ranked players might wait ages to find the exact match. Rivals' approach is willing to bend the rules a bit, kind of like mixing skill levels in a team, to reduce wait under the belief that playing is more fun than waiting. I tend to agree. And then the last pro that I can think of is it just encourages adaptability. So by sometimes putting players in uncomfortable situations, like off rolls or just carrying weaker teammates once you get good, it challenges them to adapt. For competitive folks, this can actually really foster skill growth in versatility and maybe even leadership. You might become a better player overall by learning to handle a variety of match conditions, not just fair fights. Hey, these guys are rushing to spawn. Should I just sit here and chat, or do I go and help? Little things like that can really help you out. So I'm a glass half full kind of person. I like to think of this as a positive. Now let's talk about the bad stuff. The first one I can think of is there's just this perceived lack of fairness. I talked about it in detail, but many players feel really cheated by this system. And I understand how that feeling comes about. Just the integrity of ranked competition really comes into question if the rules aren't consistent. So in a fair match, you'd say, may the best team win. In a heavily engagement-driven match, one could just cynically say, may the algorithm decide. And that, I think, undercuts the competitive spirit. I'm not an amazing player. I'm new to these games, and I just hit platinum last night, so I'm very proud of myself. But rising to platinum and now facing the reality that I want to go to diamond and other ranks, knowing all of this is in my head, definitely undercuts it a bit. The second one is a lot of high skill players are just frustrated or will get frustrated. So the best players will often want to test their skills in a pure environment. When they feel that the system is throwing them curveballs, like weaker teammates or just some forced weird probability scenarios, it's very frustrating. They don't want to, they don't want training wheels or artificial difficulty. They want their true skill to be the only factor. And I get that. Some are just going to quit out of frustrations or a sense that the game isn't rewarding their time. And we see this sentiment in the Marvel Rivals community a lot, with some skilled players announcing their departure due to the EOMM system. Then I can also think of just it's complex and it's unpredictable. So the system is so complex that even developers and data scientists struggle to perfectly tune it. And that tells you something. That means it might make some mistakes, a lot of mistakes. So you could get matches that end up just horribly one-sided, or bizarre outliers that slip through the algorithm's, testing. And when it does, players won't just see it as a one-off error. They'll potentially view it as proof of malicious rigging, and then they can get really pissed. So the lack of transparency amplifies this. Players just don't know why a match was bad, so they just assume the worst. The last con I'll give you here is just the ethical and long-term issues it proposes. So if players feel manipulated, that erodes trust. In the short term, they might keep playing the Skinner box effect, if anybody knows it, or of variable rewards that can be pretty compelling sometimes. But in the long run, it can foster a lot of cynicism and burnout. So now we're in the honeymoon period. I don't know what it's going to look like in 6 months. So, a game can develop a reputation for being unfair or pay to win in some cases, even if money isn't directly involved. Kind of any whiff of trying to get engagement to monetization can really tarnish perception. So if Marvel Rivals is seen as too psychologically manipulative, it might drive away the exact dedicated community that would sustain it for years. And I know, I've made Marvel Snap videos. Marvel Snap is a mobile card game that suffers from exactly that. And if you want to kind of see a telltale case of that and people leaving the game behind, me included, this is why I'm making Rivals content now and I don't cover Snap anymore. This is it right there. Oh, hello, person that skipped the whole video just to get to this part. Anyway, so what is the conclusion? Rigged or just reality? Well, the answer is both simpler and more complicated than the question implies. It's rigged in the same way that a theme park ride is rigged. The ups and downs and thrills of it are engineered. They're planned. It's just a bunch of metal. But the fun you're feeling and the puke that's coming out of your mouth, that's entirely real. So in a just purely competitive sense, rigging suggests deceit. So it's the idea that the outcomes are preordained, or that someone is pulling strings so that the matches aren't on the same level. Marvel Rivals' matchmaking isn't rigged in that overly nefarious way. No one is sitting at a control panel somewhere saying, give Nerf Pool a loss. He's been kicking ass. That's not happening. There's no evidence of the game flat out choosing winners or tweaking your damage in real time to make you lose a fight. Come on, like, that's nuts. You can always, through skill and teamwork, locking in, good communication, just overcome the challenges that the system throws at you. Nothing is unwinnable or unwinnable by design in absolute terms. However, Marvel Rivals is for sure using a sophisticated matchmaking algorithm that has its own agenda. That is proven in the papers and also through the analysis that I've made in this video. So the agenda isn't purely to create fair, even contests. It's just to keep you playing and enjoying or at least be engaged with the game. That's it. And yeah, in the pursuit of that, it may at times feel like an invisible hand is orchestrating your rise and fall. You know, the system giveth and the system taketh away, and it doesn't even tell you when and it doesn't tell you why. So perhaps the truth is best seen as just a nuanced explanation rather than just a binary verdict. So Rivals' matchmaking lies in a gray zone, and here's why. It strives for balance, first of all, but not the traditional kind of balance we expect in competitive rank play. It's just balancing engagement metrics with fairness. Also, it protects new or faltering players, which is arguably a really good thing, but in doing so, it might hold back really good players momentarily just to level things out. It also doesn't want you to leave angry or bored, but ironically, that very effort can make people angry if they become aware of it. So that's kind of silly. For casual players, this system can be really a blessing. It just smooths out the extremes and ensures that more games feel competitive. For competitive purists, it can feel like a curse. So it's just this ever-present handicap system that kind of muddles the true display of skill. So in my investigative journey here, I saw that the idea of engagement-based matchmaking didn't just start with Marvel Rivals. It's part of a broader evolution in gaming, just from the early ELO days of chess to today's kind of machine learning driven techniques. Marvel Rivals is just one of the higher profile cases where the community spotted the man behind the curtain, so to speak, thanks in part to those research papers like the EOMM and OptMatch. Knowing about them has, kind of ironically, made players really suspicious. Transparency is a double-edged sword, man. If players don't like what they see, they start to lose trust. Marvel Rivals' matchmaking is just engineered in a way, not to guarantee specific outcomes, but just to shape an overall experience. And whether that crosses the line into feeling unfair is really a subjective topic, and it really varies player to player. So in the end, we just must reflect on what we want from our games. If the answer is pure competition and merit-based progression, then Marvel Rivals' system is just going to feel antagonistic to that. Maybe even unacceptable for a lot of players. But if the answer is exciting matches and a healthy game community, then, the system's goals start to make a lot of sense, even if the execution might need some tuning. One thing is very clear to me is that the discussion Marvel Rivals has sparked will be important for the future of online games. It forces developers to consider how much they should prioritize engagement over transparency and fairness. And it does push players to ask how much algorithmic meddling they're comfortable with. And that's going to become more and more of a thing, especially with AI on the rise. So we almost have to get used to it. And as players, I think being informed is our best tool. Understanding the forces at play shows that we can adapt and just make our own choices to play, to pause, or just to move to a different game if that aligns with our philosophy. And that was the purpose of this entire monstrosity of a video, is to inform, to help you see different perspectives of this matchmaking, to also nerd out a little bit. I think it's really cool that things have evolved to this extent, all the way from chess now to here. And I'm excited to see where it goes, because I do like that it's focused on shaping an experience that the developers intend. I just have some combating feelings with how healthy that is for a competitive environment. But overall, It was incredibly fun for me to learn all of this. It was exhausting to make this and to research everything. So hopefully you appreciated it. And I'm looking forward to seeing how NetEase, advances with this. And even though don't want to look at a research paper again in the near future, I would be excited to see new developments around this topic because I think it's genuinely kind of cool. So the next time you find yourself in a baffling losing streak or an effortless win streak in Marvel Rivals, you'll know that it might not be mere luck of the draw. There's a system in the shadows, a balancing and rebalancing of the scales. Rigged? Not exactly, but neither is it the level playing field we once imagined. It's something new, a battleground where human skill and machine strategy intersect. And in this new arena, the final judgment on whether that's right or wrong is up to each of you.